Welcome everyone. This is the second webinar in our 5-part series on pasture management for small ruminant producers. Our topic tonight is pasture plants, including alternative forages. Again, our speaker is Jeff Semler. Jeff is a county extension agent here in Washington County, which is where our research center is located. Jeff and I work on just about everything together on small ruminants. He's in charge of the forage program for our buck test, and we utilize a lot of alternative forages, and he'll probably have a few pictures of those. Again, interactions via the chat box after Jeff's presentation. We'll stay online for some more questions and answers. You have been receiving the URL that has links to recordings and PowerPoint presentations. Last week's presentation, the recording is available. It's not yet been converted to YouTube. The PowerPoint presentation is up. We'll try to get those things done as quickly as possible. Again, if you haven't already subscribed to the listserv, please do so. That allows us to communicate with you about the webinars, upcoming ones, the ones you participate in, sometimes get some feedback from you. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic and turn the program over to Jeff.
Okay, we're ready to go then. Of course, this is the second in a 5-part series. We're going to talk about pasture plants today. You'll get a little bleed into grazing management next week with pasture plants, and you'll get a little bleed this evening with management with pasture plants, but we'll do our best to focus. Of course, that's the instructors you've heard from Susan and myself. That's me moving some of the bucks in our test, believe it or not, and to my, as I'm facing you, to my right, that field is actually max Q tall fescue, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So this evening, our pasture plants, what I want you to remember as you're trying to decide what pasture plants to manage for, plant, and so on, again, what's your goal, what's your farm resources, what's your management system, which is going to be very important, and be flexible. You know the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? Well, one bite at a time. So don't go out there after tonight and decide you're going to rip up every corner of your pasture system and reseed. Do a little on-farm testing as well when you move through. A good rotational grazing system begins with a forage system that allows the maximum number of grazing days per year with forages that are suited to the land, the livestock, and the manager. And I think those are important things to remember. The land, the livestock, and the manager. The question for oftentimes I hear about grazers is, am I managing grass or am I managing animals? And in most cases, you're managing grass with animals. So that was a little double speak there, but nonetheless. So this evening we're going to break down the forages into groups: grasses, legumes, and forbs, and then amongst those there are both perennials and annuals. The reason we like to talk about these types of things is here's a typical grazing calendar. Again, this will change depending on where you are in the United States or the world. Obviously, as some of our friends from the north said, spring's not going to come to them till August. But in a typical mid-Atlantic, and that's where we live, we're looking at cool season grasses starting up in late March to early April, and we'll go through a little bit of what's called a summer slump in July, August, late June, July, and August, maybe early September. And then the warm season grasses can take over there with some legumes and certainly some summer annuals. And then this is another way to look at it, this grazing curve, as they say. You see the one line is with the big hump in the spring and the smaller hump in the fall are the cool season grasses. The legumes tend to fill in that summer slump a bit, and the warm season grasses tend to do the best job of filling that summer slump. So grasses, we have both, as I mentioned, cool season and warm season grasses. In the mid-Atlantic, our grasses, or our forage system, is built around cool season perennial grasses. Now, if you're listening to me from Mississippi or Alabama, that's probably not the case. But here, from here north, especially into the Carolinas and Missouri, and so on, they're looking at basically a cool season grass base. So what are cool season perennials? Orchardgrass is one of my favorite grasses. I think it's a cornerstone of a grazing program, and we'll talk about that. The fescue, and I've seen a question about the fungus. I'm going to get to that one. I'll deal with the fungus-infected fescues. Kentucky bluegrass, Timothy, Bromegrass, perennial ryegrass, and reed canarygrass. As I already told you, orchardgrass is one of my favorite grasses. It's a bunch grass. It's a tall growing grass. It's a cool season perennial. It's one of the most productive. It's fairly drought resistant, and it's got good winter hardiness, especially for us here in the mid-Atlantic. One thing I will tell you as we go through this evening, when you're looking at a variety or looking for varieties that are going to match your system, make sure you look for a variety tests that are done in your climate or close to your climate. There's no sense in taking variety data from Mississippi if you live in central Wisconsin. Those kind of things, you're going to maybe see a very productive grass and you plant it and it winter kills. So be very careful when you start to look at varietal data and those test trials. It's not as winter hardy or as drought tolerant as tall fescue or bromegrass, but it is well adapted to grow with legumes. And I don't believe in monocultures, so when we get to the very end, we'll talk a little bit about mixtures in our pasture plantings. It establishes pretty easily. Bromegrass is one of the harder to establish, and we'll talk about when we get there. Stands are very productive. They're long-lasting, and like I said, they grow well with alfalfa. This is the picture actually is the orchardgrass planted at our research station, and those are goats about from the 2 years ago test, and they are enjoying the orchardgrass. It will persist, and but it is not tolerant of wet areas. If you have a wet area, chances are you have reed canary or tall fescue or weeds or nothing growing in that area. Tall fescue is one of those love-hate relationship grasses. It's a bunch grass. It will form a dense sod. It does work well in high traffic areas. It is a very tolerant grass when it comes to variability in fertility and all those other types of things. It will start growing earlier. As a matter of fact, we've had some years here in Maryland where the temperatures are such in the wintertime that it even grows in January and sometimes in February depending on the temperature. It is very deep-rooted. We have taken a backhoe and we have measured tall fescue roots in excess of 24 inches in the ground. This is the variety that gives all fescue a bad name. Kentucky 31. It's the most common. It was discovered on a knob, as I understand the lore, in Kentucky, and guess what? In 1931. It is endophyte infected. When the plant is infected, there's no way to get rid of that endophyte infection. It has wide blades, as you see. There's pronounced veining. It is a darker and a different green if you're going to compare it to, say, an orchardgrass, which is a more blue-green. And when you take your fingers down the side of that blade, you will feel the serration on it. And the symptoms for some of the fescue poisoning is nervousness, rough hair coat, elevated body temperature, and so on. One of the ways to utilize this grass in the summertime is to interseed legumes or other grasses. As they say, dilution is the solution for pollution. Red clover works very well, or even the white clovers work very well with K31. It is a bunch grass, and because of that, and the way some people manage their pasture systems, is they will notice that they will have these big clumps of grass that the animals refuse to eat, and then everything else around it is eaten almost to the dirt. Chances are pretty good that they've got two Kentucky natives going on there. We have Kentucky 31, which is those big clumps that nobody eats, and Kentucky Bluegrass, which is what's being eaten to the ground. So there are other types of tall fescue. There's low endophyte, there's endophyte free, and there's novel endophyte. Again, the low endophyte has been selected to have a low amount of endophyte in it. The endophyte freeze, Cajun 2 is one of those varieties, but there's many varieties that they've have taken the endophyte or excluded the endophyte. And then the novel endophyte is basically, instead of where that endophyte would be in the plant, they've inserted a novel endophyte. That's Max Q or Jessup, which is the most common variety of novel endophyte. And all those have very similar characteristics of K31, but they're not quite as tolerant. They don't persist as long. They're not quite as good at heavy traffic as K31. So that endophyte makes that tall fescue that variety of tall fescue quite a bit advantageous to a lot of things. One thing I will say about the endophyte infected and all fescues in general is they do a great job for winter stockpiling. So graze them in the spring, leave them in the summer if you have the acreage to do so, and then graze them after a killing frost. What happens is the killing frost causes a physiological change in the plant where the starches are turned to sugars, and actually we've had in our county here in western Maryland, we've had tall fescue in December in the field forage tested 21% protein and very good sugars. A lot of our guys here will winter their beef cattle on it. They'll dig through the snow as long as it's not as deep as it is up north right now, or as long as there's not a crust of ice on it. But basically, if you want to think about it, an animal will basically root through enough snow until it gets to their eyes. We winter a lot of beef cattle in this area on nothing but stockpiled tall fescue. Kentucky Bluegrass. That is a low-growing, but it's a high-quality forage. It does most of its growing just like most cool seasons in the spring and the fall. It goes semi-dormant in the summer months. The nice thing about Kentucky Bluegrass is it doesn't completely shut down quite as much as some of the other cool seasons. It does spread by rhizomes, and it does withstand overgrazing. If you've got a field where you graze real tight, chances are you've got Kentucky Bluegrass growing in that field because it's one of the grasses that will indeed tolerate that type of grazing. Timothy's a short-lived bunch grass. Lots of people, especially horse people, like Timothy. It's because of its susceptibility to a lot of disease and insects. It's not been something that's been a great grass for us in this area. It has really waned in its use. It is a good companion with Bromegrass because Bromegrass is slower to establish. So if you plant Bromegrass and Timothy together, as the Bromegrass stand increases, the Timothy stand kind of wanes. And it is better for haying than for grazing. It's not quite as tolerant of grazing. Bromegrass is a great grass. It's a good sod former. It's deep-rooted. It spreads with rhizomes. It's the most widely used cool season grass in North America. The further north you go, when I say that, remember I'm in Maryland, it has higher livability. The further south you go, you get into some problems with temperature extremes, especially drought, but it's definitely a great quality grass. Perennial ryegrass is one of those grasses, again, if you're in the right place, it is a great forage. But most of us don't live in that place. Most of you, I guess, that I'm talking to, or I'm pretty sure that I'm talking to, don't live in Ireland. and don't live in the Netherlands and don't live in New Zealand. And what's the commonality of all those places? Temperate climates that have high moisture levels. When we planted perennial ryegrass here in our forage tests in western Maryland, I thought our winters would kill it. In actuality, our summers killed it. We get too hot and we get too dry, and it doesn't persist, or it hasn't persisted for us here. If you're able to irrigate, it's completely different. Reed canary grass is a grass that certainly has its place. It does like wet feet, unlike some of our grasses and some of our legumes. It is one of those grasses that can be planted in those areas where it doesn't dry out quite as early, so we can make that hay or graze later into June. But as it sounds, the reed is actually not a reed at all. It's a tightness of stems and leaves, but it is something that will get into refusal when it comes to grazing, especially once an animal has to put its head down in through those quote-unquote reeds to graze. But it's certainly a great forage when it comes to quality. It can, again, in the right place, as with most forages, can do a good job for you. Cool season annuals. Cool season annuals are one of those things that I think annuals have a place in every system, whether it be interseeding or whether it be seeding them in a field and then in concert with warm season annuals. But I think there's lots of opportunity. I don't believe we take enough advantage of cool season annuals or warm season annuals for that matter, but we will. But it's not there. Like anything else, it's not for everyone. Oats is a great forage. It can be used both in the spring and in the fall, depending on your latitude. But here in our area, in the Mid-Atlantic and South, the oats can be seeded early in March. In some cases, the further south you go, maybe even into February, can be grazed, and then a warm season annual can be planted behind it in the May-June time frame. And then again, if you want, you can come back with oats in the fall, the August-September time frame, and plant it again. Seeding rates need to be a little bit higher when you're planting in that fall season. The higher seeding rates for two reasons. One is because the day length and certain other things, we need to have more plants, we need to have smaller stems, and again here, 60 to 70 days after seeding, we can harvest a crop if you want, if you need forage, or certainly graze the crop. If you have a great amount of acreage that you don't think you can get over in a timely fashion, my suggestion would be to stagger the seeding dates. And so seed a piece, go ahead and seed another piece maybe 2 weeks later. A few years ago, I did a little trial here in western Maryland. I started seeding after what would have been normally wheat harvest. And so basically I started the middle of July and I seeded every 2 weeks until the middle of September. And believe it or not, I gained no forage advantage by seeding that early. My best advantage was gained by seeding in that mid-August time frame. You can see here the picture. If you can't read that, that's peas and oats and barley. That's a mixture. Austrian winter pea is often planted with oats here in the Mid-Atlantic, and they will do some. The oats will typically winter kill, but the peas will sometimes overwinter depending on how harsh our winters are. Italian or annual ryegrass, and again, something that can be interseeded into a perennial sod. It can be seeded into with oats. The oats would winter kill in the fall. The annual ryegrass would be there in the spring. You can get some fall grazing depending on when you get it in a timely fashion. If you get it in mid-August, you can graze it in the fall. it is a nitrogen hog. So if nitrogen and expense is a concern, then know that this species likes nitrogen. It responds well to nitrogen, but it can be a limiter. It is one of the first to graze in the spring. You can typically get on annual ryegrass in our area, barring any late winter snowstorms. You can typically get on that by the middle of March. It's a high quality forage. It does regrow fast, and it is a option overfeeding. It's a lower cost option overfeeding stored forage. I will tell you, when managed properly, you can get a fair amount of tonnage off of annual ryegrass. We've experienced tonnage, and I should probably tell you a little bit about our forage work here at the Research Center, because I've referenced it already several times. When I talk about these things, we managed our forage and we did what we call mimic grazed. We harvested the forage with a flail mower, leaving 3 inches of residue, and then we weighed the amount. We basically harvested 1/1000th of an acre. We weighed it, and we took dry matter we actually did a dry matter analysis as well as some forage analysis. So we mimic grazed, and when I say we got 4 tons off this, I mean 4 tons of dry matter off of our annual ryegrass, some of the varieties of annual ryegrass. And that is, again, both spring and fall harvest. So we harvested it, for instance, if we would have planted fall of 2014, we would have had probably 1 harvest in the fall, and then we'd have had 4, typically we had 4 harvests in the spring. So that kind of gives you an idea of the way that when I reference our trial, it may make a little more sense to you. Oh, I want to go back. Italian ryegrass can be managed as a biennial. It's often planted in the fall and harvested like an annual, but if it's planted in the spring, it will not produce seed the first year, but will produce seed the second year. And yes, Katie, mimic grazing means we're mowing in a certain way. We're using a flail mower. It was actually specially made for us at the Forage Research Center in Wisconsin, and we put it on a John Deere 935, a lawnmower basically, and we allow 3-inch residue. Now there is some things with that don't actually mimic grazing. There is our mower does not put any saliva on the plant, so there's not some of the biologic aspects of grazing that goes on, just the mechanical aspects. Winter cereals are another thing that's often overlooked, at least here in the Mid-Atlantic, when it comes to small ruminant producers and to a lesser extent beef cattle producers. And that would be barley, rye, triticale, spelt, and wheat. Primarily in our area, the winter cereals are barley, rye, wheat, and triticale. Wheat sometimes is used mostly for commodity crop, but if you're in Oklahoma or Texas and you're listening to me, there's lots of stocker cattle on wheat right now. The picture is barley, and yes, you can plant annual ryegrass with clover or Italian ryegrass with clover. We're going to get to companion plantings with legumes here when we get to the legume section, but certainly there is some synergy with legumes and grasses, and there is some nitrogen trade, but not quite as much as you might think. So back to our winter cereals there. Barley is a really high quality, can be a high quality forage. Rye is very tonnage oriented. It is a great producer, but it's one of those things that you have to graze pretty early and stay ahead of it because it does go to seed quite early, or go to head, which is when our quality really tanks, and it'll go to head in early to mid-May, which is, if you're spring lambing or spring kidding, is about the time when you need the highest amount of nutrition. And what happens is your rye is going south and your nutrition level is going north, and they don't meet. Triticale, for those that don't know, is a true cross of rye and wheat, so it has some of the best traits of both. It certainly is a high-quality forage. It is one that does not mature quite as rapidly as rye. If you get it planted early enough, you can get some fall grazing with it. It's another one that makes a great companion planting with oats. You plant your triticale and oats in the fall, predominantly graze the oats in the fall, get the triticale in the spring. Spelt is a cousin to wheat, primarily grown for milling, but certainly there are some folks, especially in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, that are indeed grazing it. And again, wheat kind of doesn't need any introduction, as they say. Festulolium is a cross between fescue and ryegrass. It's not truly an annual. It's a short-lived perennial. There are varieties that are out there that some favor the fescue and some favor ryegrass in their habits. In other words, some are shinier. If you've ever seen a waxy, shiny ryegrass, and higher in sugars, not quite as persistent when it comes to being tough. Like a fescue, but it, again, palatability-wise, and there's others that kind of tend towards the fescue, more persistent, a little more resistant to heavy use, but yet it still retains some of the better qualities when it comes to forage quality of fescue. Again, we had good luck with that in our plantings here. It's another one that if you need to thicken a stand or, shall we say, beef up a stand, you can plant it right into a perennial sod. Again, most of the time when I'm talking about planting in their perennial sod, I'm talking about a sod that you've grazed very tightly in the fall. And again, remember, for me, fall is between August 15th and September 15th here in the Mid-Atlantic. Obviously, the further north you get, your window closes earlier, and the further south you get, you've got more of an opportunity. Warm season grasses, we have both, again, annuals and perennials. We're going to start out with the annuals. Sorghum, Sudan grass, and millet are the most populars. These are actually goats on our test eating a forage sorghum. Typically, I would not recommend using forage sorghum for small ruminants, primarily because of the fact that it can get fairly woody. When I say that, it grow much faster than we could utilize it with our goats anyway, because of our stocking rates. And the other thing is, they will refuse to eat the stalk. So you got these big, almost like sapling stalks out there. But they do as you can see, they loved it. They did well on it. It does get, one of the added benefits of these warm season annuals is does get the animal's head up. And when it gets the animal's head up, the parasites are down there where they won't bother them so much. So that's certainly a benefit of grazing some of these warm season annuals. There is a problem with the first three, sorghum, Sudan grass, and Sudan grass, when it comes to frost and prussic acid poisoning. So you need to remember that when it gets close to, and I'm sorry, I apologize for the misspelling of Sudan grass. But when you get close to that killing frost, or the frost in the winter, in the fall, make sure you take your animals out of that. And once it's dead and brown, for instance, if you have a nice Sudan grass stand and you've grazed it and come in and plant a cool season, whether it be ryegrass or oats or whatever, go ahead and let that Sudan grass die, turn brown, or sorghum, and then you can turn the animals back in. They can eat the dead stuff, no problem, but they won't have the problem with the prussic acid poisoning. Millet is certainly my choice. It's finer bladed, it's finer stemmed. There are some, shall we say, reasons to be cautious with millet. From our perspective, we planted dwarf millet. It's called Wonderleaf. It's a little leafier. It doesn't grow as tall, and our goats love it. Last year we planted it in concert with sun hemp, and the goats went in, stripped the sun hemp first, and then went ahead and ate the millet. I will tell you that if you get some of the taller varieties of millet, the goats at our test station refuse to go in it. And because, again, remember, they're a prey species, they can't see down because we plant this millet on 7.5-inch rows. They can't see down the row. They don't like to, so they ate around the edges. What I had to do was go through with a flail mower and mow some alleys, and then they went into the field and did a much better job of forage utilization. Will the sheep eat sorghum once it gets tall? Again, sorghum would not be my choice for grazing most of our small ruminants. Again, it worked for us in a very limited capacity with our goats there. I would much prefer Sudan grass or millet, millet being my first choice. Warm season perennials, there's some Bermuda grass and crabgrass are the first two that I'll talk about because they're introduced species. Those are, if you're listening to me in Florida or Alabama or Louisiana or somewhere like that, you're very familiar with Bermuda grass. You use it a lot. You probably have seeded annual ryegrass in it for the wintertime, and again, you're probably grazing the annual ryegrass right now. Crabgrass is another one that can indeed be both perennial and annual. It comes out of the west. Oklahoma is a big place that we get seed, at least here, and I've tried it here. This is not your grandfather's crabgrass. In other words, this is not the crabgrass that your neighbor hates in his front yard. This is a forage type grass. It grows much higher. Again, it's something that's often grown in off season with annual ryegrass. So you'll plant annual ryegrass, and then they'll plant crabgrass, and then once that crabgrass gets going, some of it will reseed itself, but they'll put annual ryegrass with it. Then what we more commonly consider native warm season grasses: switchgrass, big blue stem, little blue stem, eastern gamma grass, so on. Those are again, at one point in time, were native to the eastern United States. It was a lot of those species were plowed up prior to the Dust Bowl in the southwest. They are certainly biomass producers. One of the issues with those particular grasses are they are not the most high. They're not the highest quality grass when it comes to what I would consider our modern livestock that are much, much more production oriented, if you know what I mean, versus the bison who go out there and we don't care if we don't harvest the bison until they're 3 years old, but we certainly don't want to steer that old. So those grasses don't quite perform. If you're reintroducing them, I will tell you it takes a long time to establish them. We planted some here in Washington County, and we're taking 3 years to get a good establishment. Most people don't have the luxury of having enough real estate to be able to take ground out of production in order to wait for these warm seasons to establish themselves. Legumes. There's lots of different legumes. I'm going to deal with a few here. Alfalfa, clovers, Birdsfoot, Trefoil, and Lespedeza. The picture there is crimson clover, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Alfalfa is used to be called the queen of the forages. It's a high quality perennial in a good and a well managed grazing system, can last 8 years or more. There is a higher establishment cost. I would not, unless I was making hay, I would not seed it without seeding it with a grass. Or if you wanted to, again, you could do, if you wanted to add a legume, and the legume of your choice was alfalfa, you need to go in there and really graze down your grass tightly, and then in late August, drill in some alfalfa, and then stay off of it until the alfalfa gets established the next spring. You guys are really, really ahead of me here. We're going to get to chicory. Clovers, we have crimson clover, which is an annual, can be planted almost any time. We have red clover. Some of you are very familiar with red clover. A lot of times you'll hear people say red clover is about a 3-year lifespan. Not really. We have, I think of red clover almost as an annual. You plant it the first year, you're disappointed. The second year, you wonder where all the red clover came from. And the third year, you wonder where all the red clover went. It will reseed itself. That's a plus. Red clover is a good companion for fescue or any of the other grasses, but certainly here in our country, we think of a lot of it times we will interseed red fescue or red clover into fescue. Now's a great time to be seeding these clovers, by the way, what we call frost seeding, at least in our area. You can go out there and spread your clover seed. Some of the old timers used to say they sowed their clover with the last snow, but certainly the reds, the whites, the ladinos can be spun on at this point in time when there's frost in the ground, as they say. We get the freezing and thawing, the heaving of the ground. You can certainly get a very good establishment of clover this time of year. Arrowleaf clover, one of the most famous ones is Durana. Again, they are a very prolific forage producer, and again, I would not have a grazing system that didn't have grass and clover in it. Birdsfoot trefoil, it's a perennial. It's one of those nice legumes that doesn't cause bloat. Bloat is always a concern with people that have legumes. You can manage for legumes with legumes and not worry about bloat. When you frost seed clover, the bare ground, or the ground doesn't have to be bare, but it has to be what we would call open, where you can get soil to seed contact. So you want to make sure when you're spinning your clover on, it doesn't have to be bare, but there do need to be spots where the seed can get to the soil. Birdsfoot trefoil can reseed itself. It's not susceptible to Phytophthora, which is a type of root rot, or a lot of the alfalfa insects. So it can indeed be grown in areas where there's problems with alfalfa. Sericea lespedeza. It's a deep-rooted perennial legume that persists for many years. It's high in tannins. Folks probably have heard or read about the fact that it's an anthelmintic. In other words, it helps with parasites. By the way, trefoil does too, as Susan mentions there. I am cautious about Sericea lespedeza because I realize that I am talking to people outside of the state of Maryland, and it is on the noxious weed list in some states. Colorado and Kansas being two, and Missouri and Oklahoma are considering it. So it is one of those things that you need to scarify the seed, and if you're going to try to establish it, so scarify means you need to get it, you need to rough it up, if you will. What about forbs? When I say forbs, and I segregated chicory out here because I wanted you to understand that this chicory is not the blue flower that when you walk across, flowered variety, that when you walk across your lawn in the summertime and that stem pokes you in the bottom of the feet, that is not the same as forage chicory. You see a goat right here eating some forage chicory. We had a plot in our test for a number of years, and that might even be one of our goats right there, yellow ear tag. But anyway, it's a very good forage. It is high in tannins, and I like it a lot. The reason we took it out was we had some thistle pressure in that particular field, and I'll tell the story about thistles when I get to weeds. Brassicas, read here, basically turnip family. They're high yielding, they're fast growing, they're suitable for grazing, and certainly something that can be interseeded into a poor doing sod or can be put into crop field or anything else. One of the things about the brassicas is in addition to the stems and leaves, a lot of times the bulbs will be eaten. We've seen places where the cattle will pull the bulb out of the ground, but a lot of times goats and sheep will just eat cups into the bulbs because they can't pull them out, but they certainly like them. And again, as I said, turnips, rape, radishes, kale, and mustard. Some of the weeds, dandelion, dock, plantain, lamb's quarter, thistle, mare's tail I didn't put on here. A lot of these in our system, in our pasture system at the research farm, our goats readily eat them when they're young. Typically that's one of the keys, is especially when you get into some of these woody herbaceous type weeds, lamb's quarter, some of the others. They'll strip the leaves off of them, but you'll just see these big sticks or stalks or whatever you want to call them sticking out of the pasture fields. Plantain, of course, is lower growing. Dock, curly dock, cocklebur, some of those others. Burdock, they eat very well. When it comes to thistle, my favorite story about thistle is we had the chicory field there, and in that field we had a rock break, and when we turned our goats in, the rock break was completely covered with Canada thistle, and it was at least 3 to 3.5 feet tall. The first thing the goats did when they went into that field was ate the Canada thistle right down to the ground. Now, at first glance, you would say, well, then goats are great for taking thistle and controlling it. Actually, what we learned, or what I learned, was that goats like the high ground. The rock break was the highest point in the field, and they established a beachhead on that rock break. So they went in there and they ate that young Canada thistle down because it was advantageous for them. In the corners of the field where there was Canada thistle, they didn't touch it. And that's another reason why you need to think about grazing behavior as well as plant species. Mixtures. I like mixtures, whether they're in annuals, whether it's perennials. I don't like a monoculture of any kind. I think it's a great idea to have legumes in your grasses. I think it's a great idea to have legumes in your annuals. I think it's a great idea to have grasses in your legumes. Even if you're one of those folks that happen to be an alfalfa person that maybe makes some hay, I would say absolutely positively there needs to be grass in that alfalfa. Our dairy farmers have learned that. It's kind of funny how old things become new again, but your grandfather probably had grass in his alfalfa. Now today, the research scientists in some of these big dairy universities are talking about adding grass back into alfalfa stands because of the fact that it's very palatable. There's some things that the alfalfa gives us that the grass can't, and vice versa. The grass gives us some nice non-structural structural carbohydrates, and our alfalfa gives us some great protein as well. But certainly when one sits down and starts thinking about forage species, they need to take everything into consideration. When we talked about forbs, and I'm just going to go back just a second here, and weeds, it's one of the reasons why I really like the idea of multi-species grazing, because cattle will let a lot of those quote-unquote weeds alone, but if you're running sheep with them, or sheep and goats with them, those small ruminants tend to prefer and like to eat some of what we would otherwise call weeds. Typically, that's why I like the word forb a little better, because a weed is nothing more than a plant out of place. I think it's hilarious that today with Roundup Ready technology, we have corn that actually becomes a weed in a soybean field because it's Roundup Ready soybeans and it's Roundup Ready corn, and we can't we're not able to kill it with that particular herbicide program. So the fact is that the corn is not wouldn't often be thought about as a weed, but it's a plant out of place, and so it makes itself a weed because it's in a soybean field. I saw a little bit of here about cypress spurge. I will tell you that out west there's some spurge grazing that's done to control fuel loading in some of our national forests and national parks, done with sheep, because the spurge out there can get dry and be quite flammable. And Joy mentioned it in Colorado. We're going to take some time now to I will watch the chat box and certainly be happy to answer your questions. There's lots of I've been watching some of the questions in here, but not paying a whole lot of attention. But sheep and goats are great for vegetation control. I think it's one of the untapped things that goats could really be utilized for is vegetation control. I don't know if they serve goat in that restaurant or not, Susan. Can I identify, George, your question is, can I recommend a source to identify grasses? Absolutely. Dan Unslander at Wisconsin has a great book for identifying grass. What I'm going to do, because I apologize it wasn't on this slide, it was last week, I'm sorry. I'm going to put in my email address. Please feel free to email me and I will be happy to send you the link to that. There's one from Purdue that Susan put up there. So let me go back here, and can you grow Lespedeza in Massachusetts? Probably maybe difficult to get that established, but it would be something that I wouldn't spend a lot of money on seed, but certainly would try a little spot. To reseed pasture, do I suggest burning down the existing pasture or grazing closely and then drilling? I would go to grazing, depending on what my weed pressure was. And again, I use the weed word, but I would typically graze it tightly and drill it. As far as forbs, Clinton, forbs are basically brassicas, what some people call weeds, and chicory I singled out because of the good qualities that it has. Do I recommend your local seeds co-op as a seed supplier? What I would do is do my research on the internet and look for reputable, when I say reputable, read here, university studies, and then I would shop close to home. Most of your seed suppliers around your area will carry nationally recognized companies. And again, for instance, here in our area we have a co-op called Southern States, and Southern States has a variety of orchardgrass called Benchmark Plus, and Benchmark Plus was one of the better varieties in our trials. So I certainly would recommend your local seed dealers. Again, I would check out the varieties online first, and again, look for university studies that are similar to your climate. So Tennessee, I'm not sure about. I probably wouldn't look at northern Wisconsin. I'd probably look to Gary Lacefield over at University of Kentucky. They do a great job and a lot of work in forages at UK. And again, I don't work for them, but I can tell you that they do a good job. Let's see. Moving down through here. You guys, I don't talk fast enough, or I talk too much, I guess. Local seed dealers may stock what's best in your area. The only thing I would caution is, again, do your research, because a lot of times they will certainly sell what sells, and that doesn't necessarily make it the best. You're trying to establish pasture in a former woodlot. pH is 4.8. Fescues will grow at that pH, but I certainly would try to get some gypsum and some lime in there to raise it. As far as what can you plant right now in South Carolina, I would say probably plant an umbrella in the sand and go to Myrtle Beach. Just kidding. You could plant some oats right now, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know exactly where you are in South Carolina. Certainly annual ryegrass can be planted in the spring. It could be planted now. So I don't know if that answered your question, Jerry, but that's certainly what I would, is from an annual perspective. Again, I prefer to plant and establish my perennial forages in the fall. You have less weed competition, and you're going to get a better establishment because in most places in the United States you get adequate fall rainfall in the fall and to get a good establishment. When it comes to existing pastures and how to use these types of plantings, first off, whenever you're trying to introduce another species into it, I always would graze as tight as I could and then come in and drill. The only time I wouldn't necessarily have to drill would be if you're going to establish clover, and you could do that now. Well, I don't know where you're at, Kathleen, but when I say that, I mean a winter seeding. As far as species mixtures, I say whatever works. Again, talk to your local county agents. For those of you that have them, talk to your extension specialists that are forage specialists. I like a base, my base around Orchardgrass, and then any other. The only grass I shy away from is perennial rye, because perennial rye to me is what I call a feel-good grass, and that is you get it greens up fast, but it doesn't persist. As far as scarifying, that means you have to rough up the seed. You can do that a number of ways. You can actually, if you have a small enough quantity, you can actually put it, if you want to think about it, put it in a cement mixer or whatever and just roll it around with some stone or something to kind of to take the edge off of it, to rough the seed coat up. Lespedeza has a really hard seed coat. I never recommend pre-soaking it. What I'd rather you do is rough the seed up. As far as forages affecting the flavor profile of the meat, I have to basically beg off a little bit on that one. I can tell you from being with my strong dairy background that there are some forages that do indeed affect the flavor profile of milk, and we've avoided them for a long time. But I can't really speak to the meat aspect. I don't know much about that. As far as okay, Jerry, I got that. What does to drill mean? Basically, I'm talking about using a seed drill, a planter. And the question is, do you have to own a planter to plant grass into an existing sod? The short answer to that is not necessarily. You certainly can do it with, there's a number of ways to do it. One of the easiest ways is graze the ground real tight. If you have a roller or a pasture drag, which this is the only time I would ever suggest using a pasture drag, is to rough the ground up a little bit, sow the seed, and then either go in there with a roller or go in there with the pasture drag turned over. You're trying to get soil to seed contact. One of the things I would not suggest is, using a pasture drag to spread manure and all that other thing. I would really rather you put that away. As far as another way to get the soil to seed contact in the ground is after you've spread the seed, it works best with well, I shouldn't say that. I can make it work with small ruminants, but with bigger hooves on cattle, it's easier to tromp in the seed. You could do it with small ruminants, but you're going to really have to tighten them up to get them to tramp that seed in the ground. The best forage for winter stockpiling is tall fescue. You can certainly plant turnips in the fall and graze them. Stockpiling is basically what we do is we especially with fescue, we graze it. We stop grazing it for several months. We allow it to accumulate. You can do that with all grasses. What I would do is, if I was stockpiling things other than tall fescue, is I would start grazing the other grasses first and save the tall fescue to last. What forbs would affect flavor? In some cases, some of the turnips do. But again, it depends on what, are they only on turnips? How much are we talking about as far as affecting the flavor? If you seed clover now by hand, how do you get the seed to the ground? Basically, certainly we want your pasture field to be grazed as tight as possible. And I would say that the way to get it to the ground is hope for some either moisture, freezing and thawing, or you could always run a roller or pasture drag over it. What are the issues if grasses go to seed? Also no mention of foxtail. That's because there's very little usefulness for foxtail. That's one of the things I would indeed call a weed. There are no issues with grasses going to seed other than the fact that they could reseed themselves, unless it's, of course, foxtail, which you don't want more of. But again, it's actually a common practice to allow for instance, if you have annual ryegrass, the annual ryegrass wants to go to seed, so you go in there and you plant millet or Sudan grass in it. You allow it to go to seed, and when you turn your animals into grazed the warm season for the first time, they kick the ryegrass seed off and stomp it in the ground. So there is some advantage to that. Again, I didn't mention broom sedge either, because broom sedge and foxtail to me are two grasses that can be a bane. If they are grazed early, that's good, but most of the time animals will choose not to graze them. Sophia says here that she feeds hay and they favor the hay over pasture. I can tell you for sure that when it greens up, they'll walk right by the hay. Don't worry about that. Any way to get rid of the sedge? I'm assuming you're talking about broom sedge here, and one of the ways is fertility and competition. Typically, pH is going to be low on areas where sedge is an issue, and certainly we need to make sure that you have a good, you want your pHs in the 6 or above range, and then clipping will help to control sedge, and also introducing more of your preferred grasses through overseeding. Foxtail, in the millet family, yes, but not what we would prefer as a millet. We have the millet, as if you want to think, is foxtail with a college education. How's that? Suggestions for getting rid of buttercup. The best way to get rid of buttercup, unfortunately, if you've got a really heavy infestation, is going to have to be herbicide, and then I would plant. Typically, because when buttercup comes in, you want to basically outcompete it. And so the question here is there any forages that are better than outcompeting weeds? For a short term, outcompeting rye, cereal rye works very well. It has an allelopathic, its roots give off some allelopathic chemicals that suppresses other competition. Ryegrass can outcompete weeds, but it's one of the reasons why we do not recommend that you plant in the fall, because you basically by stirring the seed, even if it's with a coulter or on a drill, by stirring the soil and waking up some of those weed seeds in the springtime, you actually make things worse for yourself. Quality nutrition and protein. So the question about fescue, it does vary greatly as far as quality goes throughout the year. It's best early in the spring and late in the fall / winter. Can fresh fescue be submitted for protein tests? Absolutely. Email me and I will give you we have one of the best labs in the United States in Hagerstown, a forage testing lab. You can take a test right out of the field, and I can talk to you about that as well. But there's certainly can you also test feces for nutritive quality? Susan ought to take that one because we've done that. And what are the best forages for building organics? Any forage will work. It has more to do with management than it does to do with your actual choice of forage. And so we'll talk about that more next time when we get into the management systems. Other than fescue, to compete with stiltgrass is a tough one to outcompete. But again, I hate to keep going back to something like annual ryegrass, but that's a fast-growing grass. You can get some of a cheaper variety like golf or something like that and just throw 40 pounds to the acre out there. It can help to outcompete. The other thing you need to remember is stiltgrass is more of a warm season grass, so you can try to outcompete it with some warm season, something along the lines of millet. You want something that's going to give you a denser canopy. So millet or Sudan grass is going to give you a denser canopy than anything else. Can Johnson grass be legally purchased? I know it can be in West Virginia. I don't know about Minnesota, Don. Probably you can do it. You could contact some folks. I think in Oklahoma, I think they sell it as well. Comment on kudzu. Can't really comment on kudzu because it's an invasive, noxious weed in Maryland, and so we can't really have it. But I'll tell you this: it won't take grazing, and it won't take repeated mowing. If you've been in the South, and I know we have someone from Tennessee anyway listening, or Kentucky, it is a tremendous amount of kudzu out there, and it's growing in places where it can't be grazed or mowed. But I can tell you when I have seen it, it will grow straight up a bank or straight up a tree, but right where people are mowing repeatedly, it does not persist. What's Johnson grass?